On this channel, I consistently get asked how I manage to get natural and flattering skin tones and color in my images regardless of the gear that I use. So today I want to make a really quick video to share some tips for when out shooting as well as the editing process and show you that your camera isn't the problem when it comes to getting great skin tones. So let's just jump right into it. The first thing I want to address is that gear doesn't really matter when it comes to skin tones, or at least is not as much as people think. Over the last few years, camera color science across brands like Fujifilm, Nikon, Canon, and Sony have all become very similar, especially when you're shooting RAW and using the Adobe color profiles like Adobe Standard, which neutralizes the color and contrast, making it a consistent starting point across all the different sensors. Sure, there are some slight differences like Nikon files being more contrasty, Sony having very neutral color, and Fujifilm leaning more green due to the X-Trans sensor layout, but correcting the white balance in Lightroom is key to matching skin tone. For example, guys, here is a modern Sony file next to a 20-year-old camera, the Canon 5D Classic, both corrected for white balance and edited with the same preset to achieve a consistent look. Both these JPEGs are in the description down below, and let me know in the comment section which one you think is the Canon file. I'm very curious on how many people can actually tell a difference, as last time I did this test, 58% of you got this wrong. This Canon 5D has a reputation for amazing colors and skin tones and started this trend of Canon colors, but in reality, when using the same Adobe profile as a base to edit from, applying the same preset, all your editing adjustments, and correcting white balance and match, your eyes really cannot tell the difference between the two. So those Canon colors aren't as unique as people think. Obviously, the modern sensor from the Sony has more resolution and dynamic range, which does give a boost in color depth, but the difference and importance of this is really debatable. So you don't need the latest and greatest camera with clever marketing around color science and a cult-like following. You just need good shooting techniques, adjusting the tone, contrast, and nailing white balance is the critical factor for getting good skin tones, which we'll cover now. So with all that gear talk out of the way, the first thing you need to remember or maybe learn is that getting skin tones right starts in camera, not just in the edit. One of the biggest mistakes I see is relying completely on editing to fix skin tones, when in reality, if you get it somewhat close in camera, your editing becomes easier and more natural looking. And to demonstrate exactly what I mean, let me run a quick test on your eyes. Here is an image that's a little on the warmer side. Now, here is the same image with a cooler white balance. And now back to the warmer image. Now, sorry for lying guys, but this third image has the correct white balance. See how your eyes plays tricks on you? Our perception of color temperature shifts in just a few seconds, and this is called color adaptation. This is exactly why nailing white balance somewhat close in camera is so important, even when you're shooting RAW. Because if you don't, the whole fix it and post mindset could be based on a completely wrong perception of color. So now we know that white balance is your secret weapon. Let's talk about how I actually shoot to get great skin tones right out of camera. And to be honest guys, 90% of the time I just use auto white balance because modern cameras have really good auto white balance algorithms. There are some exceptions. For example, on my Fujifilm XT5, the auto white balance was way too cool and way too green. So I tinted mine to be warmer and more magenta. But there is times when auto white balance gets it completely wrong, like in mixed lighting or when white objects confuse the camera. That's when I'll switch to a preset. If I'm shooting in the shade, I'll be using the shade preset because shade, especially under trees, often gives the skin tones a green cast. Shade adds warmth and magenta to fix that. For overcast days, I'll actually switch to cloudy, which the name implies, which does a similar thing. It adds gentle warmth to stop skin tones from going too cool. This is my go-to when I'm shooting in the city shade as well. The only time I'll set and lock a custom white balance is A, for video work, or B, when I'm I'm shooting here in the studio. I actually used to shoot yearbook portraits, and I would always set a custom white balance with a gray card set to 50% middle gray. But guys, for everyday shooting, especially when you're working with raw files, auto white balance and occasionally switching to shade or cloudy is all I need to get great skin tones right out of camera. And honestly guys, my advice when starting out is to keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it and get too technical. But learning how and when to use custom white balance is a very underrated skill in my opinion. Alright, so before we jump onto the computer to go through some editing techniques, there's a couple of quick things I want to talk about when it comes to your screen and also your editing environment. If you're editing on a MacBook, smartphone or tablet, that's totally fine. Just lower your screen brightness to about 70% because these screens are often way too bright and can throw off your edit. If you're going to use a monitor, I recommend something like my color calibrated Asus ProArt 4K, which is what I use, and I also have this hood to block a little bit of glare to save my eyes. Another quick tip, if you're struggling with white balance when editing, try sitting near a window in natural daylight and edit around midday. This gives your eyes a nice neutral reference point of about 5500 Kelvin, which just makes judging skin tone much easier. And lastly, keep in mind, everyone is seeing your photos on different screens and all sorts of color, tints, warmth and brightness. So don't get too caught up in making it perfect. My setup is linked in the description down below if you're curious. And let's jump onto the computer and I'll show you how to get the most even contrast, color and skin tone out of your raw files. Alright guys, so here is a recent portrait that I took here on the Gold Coast of Australia, and this is actually shot on the Canon 5D Classic. By default, Adobe has selected Adobe Color as the profile, and Adobe Color is definitely my preference. Sometimes I also use Standard. Now, if you come down to the Browse tab, you'll see all of Adobe's preset, and if you look here at camera matching, you have 5 different profiles that is available for Canon only files. So if we come to camera standard, there's not really a huge difference in terms of color and contrast, and you can see even the camera landscape is very similar to Adobe landscape anyway. So now we know that if we use Adobe profiles, we can easily match all of the different camera sensors. Next, I want to talk about the importance of applying a preset and then adjusting exposure and white balance, as presets or your own adjustments can throw off the white balance due to the creative nature and the color contrast that a lot of presets include. So I've gone back to a photo that I took on my Sony a7 IV earlier in the shoot, and you can see that the Sony in auto white balance has somewhat got the white balance very similar to what we want. Now, I'm going to use my presets for an example, which are linked in the description down below if you do like the performance of these presets. So I'm going to go to my favorite one, which is Astia Soft, and automatically applying that preset, I think the image looks great. But for my taste, I feel like it made the white balance too warm and we need to add a little bit more magenta. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first boost the exposure because I like bright and airy photos, and that really does take a lot of saturation out of the skin tone by lifting the exposure. And then I'm just going to dial down my white balance ever so slightly just to remove some of that orange undertone that for me was a little bit too strong. And now I'm gonna boost up my magenta. I like to go way past what I think is good, and then I'm just gonna bring it down to somewhere about there. So if we look at a before, that's before any of the preset and the exposure and white balance adjustments, and there is an after. Just by looking at that before and after, I think there's a little bit too much magenta, so I'm just going to bring that down again slightly. Now, another tip that I've never mentioned on this channel before, if you right click the background here where the gray part is, you can actually change the background color. Now, my preference and what's technically right is medium gray, and this really just calibrates your eyes to accurately see the colors and the white balance. Alright guys, there is a few ways to get softer skin tones in Lightroom that really removes the need to do retouching or minimizing the retouching required. The first way is that I remove the contrast in the tone panel and then add the contrast back in with the tone curve. I'm not going to go through this today because I've made an entire video on these two sections which you can watch right here. But a pro tip to learn is using clarity and texture. Now there's definitely a meme to go too far on clarity. That looks gross, don't do that. You can also overdo the texture as well. But what I'm going to show you is removing the clarity of just the skin and then adding the sharpness back into the lips, the eyes, and the hair. So how I do this is I bring my clarity down to about -20 is my max, as well as my texture, and that is going to soften the skin tone a lot. But the problem is we're softening the whole overall image and we're losing the detail in the hair, the lips, the nose, etc, etc. So if we scroll down to the sharpening section, this is where we're going to add that detail back in. Just by lifting the sharpening, that is sharpening the whole overall image, meaning that it's also sharpening the skin tone, so it's undoing what we just did in the clarity slider, and that is very counterproductive. So to only select the area that we want to sharpen, we need to hold down the Option key and we need to slide up this masking tool. And you can see whereabouts we're going to be sharpening. You can also do this on the radius and only sharpen the areas that we want to sharpen and leave the skin tones alone. And then you can bring up your sharpening. The max I would ever go is about 65 or so. And if we zoom into the image, there is a before and there is an after, which softer skin tones, and we've still retained the detail in the eyes and the lips. Finally, another great technique that I always utilize in my portrait images is adding just a little bit of grain, and I like to add quite a bit, and I bring the roughness and the size down to make it more finer and less noticeable. And don't get too caught up on having a technically sharp photo. A good photo is all about viewing distance. This is the distance you're going to view the photo from. You're never going to be zooming in and looking at a face like that. So remember, it's about viewing distance, not about technical perfection. Alright guys, so now we know how to apply a creative look, how to adjust the white balance for that look. But sometimes you'll buy a preset from your favorite photographer and you're editing away and you just can't get the skin tones right, even though you have been playing with the white balance. There's just something about that preset or your own adjustments that really make the skin tones look either too pink or too green. So I'm just going to show you some advanced tips on how to fix that. And this is regarding to skin tones, especially like myself, who are more prone to flushing and redness. So I'm going to quickly show you how to fix that now, and then we're going to wrap up the video. Alright guys, for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to bring down my hue in the red primary to about -20 or so, just to upset those skin tones. So this is in the color calibration, and I never change skin tones here, purely for the fact that even when you change the blue primary, the skin tone just goes all over the show, and I use this for when I'm building a preset. So there is a few ways to fix this, and if you're getting this reddish tone, you can always just bring down the tint, but just notice that the background is also getting a green hue because this tint slider is affecting the overall image. So I'm going to undo that, and you can also just do this in the curves. So if I grab this mid-tone point and I bring it up, I can fix the skin tone as well. But again, it is adding a little bit of green in the highlights and also the shadows. And if I move this around, the image just starts to fall apart to try and correct that. I'm going to undo all of that, and I'm going to scroll down to my favorite tool, which is the color wheels. And if we just want to affect the midtones, which is where the skin is, and we're getting this pinkish color right here, what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of the opposite color, and there you go, the skin tones are fixed. Alternatively, you can also just pick on this color picker here, and that's going to allow you just to select just the skin tones in the hue and saturation. And just a quick pro tip, if you hold the Option key and then click, you can clearly see where you have selected. So bringing this down is going to add more redness. Bringing it up is going to make the skin tone more orange. And lastly, I use the luminance tab to add a bit of tan to the skin. So bringing it down is going to darken the skin, and then bringing it up is going to make the skin lighter and more fairer. Now guys, before we finish this video, I just want to give you guys a really quick bonus tip, and that is the importance of culling and curating your images. If you are a portrait photographer, you'll know that a portrait session, you can take a lot of photos, and you don't want all those photos going into your Lightroom catalog, as it does slow down your computer. So that's why I use a tool that's completely for free called Narrative Select. So if you're like me, I take a lot of photos when I do a portrait shoot. You can see up here, I took over 1100 photos during this portrait shoot, and I only sent off 74 photos to be edited in Lightroom. And you can see some of these photos, they'll have half blink or they'll be out of focus. And you can also go up here on the top left and actually zoom into the face. So I know that all of these photos that I have selected, they're not duplicates. I have narrowed it down to the ones that I want to keep, and I've made sure that they're all in focus. I can also come up here and see which ones are the Canon files and which ones are the Sony a7 IV files. And all I do, guys, is I go Command All, which selects all the photos. I go up here, Ship plus Edit, and I just ship them straight into Lightroom like that. So if you want to use this incredibly powerful workflow, go with the link in the description down below, enter your email address, and download Narrative Select for free. And while you're down there, guys, if you do like the way that I edit my photos, I do sell Lightroom presets, and as you've seen, they work across all of the different major camera brands. They're ideal for portraits, but they work for my lifestyle and landscape photography as well. And if you guys want to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to use the tone curve and the tone adjustments, and how I get this soft look, especially in those softer skin tones, go check out this video right here. And I've also made a more in-depth Lightroom tutorial about editing portraits, which you can watch right here. And if you did enjoy the video, you know what to do. Until next time, guys, we'll see you later. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye for now.